Tonight we mourn the passing of a civil and human rights giant. The Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. died on February 17th at the age of 84. I'm devoting this episode of the Justice Briefing to talking about Jackson's life, his faith, and his moral imagination. What stands out to me about Jackson in this moment is how his politics stand in sharp contrast to the politics of this regime we're under. Jackson talked about the Rainbow Coalition, a multiracial, inclusive, participatory democracy. What we are enduring under this regime is the narrowing and an exclusionary politics. In a phrase, white Christian nationalism. And so we're going to contrast the moral imagination of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition with white Christian nationalism's vision of politics. Thank you for joining me. Welcome to the Justice Briefing. This is your weekly dose of current events at the intersection of faith, history, and justice. I'm your host, Dr. Jamar Tisby. I'm a historian, an author, and the founder of Tisby Media. Happy Black History Month, folks. Always going to say that while we are in February. If you did not know, I am in the midst of a Black History Month series at my Substack publication, Footnotes. So the Black History Month series is called How Black History Teaches Us to Resist Authoritarianism. How Black History Teaches Us to Resist Authoritarianism. I published part 3 of that series this week. I'll publish part 4 this coming week. If you want to access all of those articles completely free, go to jamartisby.substack.com. While we're on that topic, the best way to support me is to become a paid subscriber at jamartisby.substack.com. Listen, it is Black History Month. What better way to commemorate Black History Month than by supporting a Black historian who studies Black history? And if you want to do that, it's just $7 a month. I got a 10-piece chicken nugget meal at McDonald's that cost somewhere around $12. So for the cost of less than the cost of one 10-piece chicken McNugget meal at McDonald's, you can support truth-telling at the intersection of faith, history, and justice. Now, if you're a regular Justice Briefing listener, you might be like, what gives, Jamar? Something's out of order. Because I'm recording this late on Wednesday night, and typically I go live Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. Set your alarm on your phone so you can catch it live. But I'll be traveling, and I'm excited about some upcoming trips. So tomorrow, as I record this, I will be in Nashville doing a live taping for the Nashville branch of PBS. We're going to be talking about race. I'm going to be up there with some phenomenal speakers on a panel, and it will be broadcast on the Nashville PBS station. So I'll be recording that, and then I'm so excited. I get to go to the Compassion and Justice Conference, which is hosted by FaithWorks, an immigrant advocacy organization. And at the Compassion and Justice Conference, we are going to do a screening of our short documentary, Jesus Was a Migrant. Jesus Was a Migrant. Now, we're going to do a screening. It's going to be a rough cut. It is exclusive for conference participants. But in April, we will be doing the public premiere of our first short documentary, Jesus Was a Migrant. This is a production of Tisby Studios, and I can't wait to tell you more about it. Again, if you want to support work like this, make sure you go to jamartisby.substack.com and become a paid subscriber. One more announcement before we dive into the life, faith, and moral imagination of Jesse Jackson. I'm honored to let you know that I have been nominated as one of the nominees for Author of the Year for the Black Christian Influencers Conference. So there's this organization called Black Christian Influencers. They're having a conference June 25th through the 28th in Chicago. So if you're in the area or you're interested, June 25th through the 28th in Chicago. And they have an award show and they have all these different categories. I've been nominated in the category Author of the Year. How do you win? You have to cast your vote. I went and I cast my vote for myself. There's some stellar authors in there in the running as well. I am just the little engine that could when you look at the size of the platforms of some of these other authors. But we can do it. So I'm going to put in the show notes a link to cast your vote for the Black Christian Influencers Author of the Year. And I would be so honored if you would vote. Now, they make you fill out your name and your email. And then I just want to give you a heads up. It's a pretty lengthy form. So you do not have to vote for every category. On the bottom right, there's an arrow. You click down till it gets to Author of the Year. And then there's my picture, and you just click it. And then you got to click down, and then press Submit. Make sure you press Submit or your vote does not count. So Black Christian Influencers, Author of the Year. I'll put the link in the show notes. And again, just honored. And that's for my latest book. This one, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. If you haven't gotten The Spirit of Justice yet, it is available wherever books are sold. I also have a bookstore on the bookshop.org website, bookshop.org, and go to the Tisby Justice Library, and you can get The Spirit of Justice. That's another way, is cast your vote, but also pick up the book. Okay, so in this episode, we are going to talk about just a brief biography of Jesse Jackson to situate us in who he was and where he was. And then we're going to talk more about his background as a Christian. I find that when really important people like Jesse Jackson pass away, they mention their faith, but it's not really a central subject. So we're going to dive in a little bit more deeply into that. But we're going to spend most of our time talking about the moral imagination of Jesse Jackson as embodied or expressed in the Rainbow Coalition, which is this really interesting, I think, metaphor and model for political theology. So let's get right into it. Jesse Jackson was born on October 8th, 1941 in Greenville, South Carolina. He was born to a teenage mother, and he was raised in poverty, or as he put it, he was raised in the slums. A lot of the quotes I think all of the quotes you're going to hear in this episode come from Jackson's 1988 speech at the Democratic National Convention, I believe it was, in Atlanta. And so in that speech in 1988, he said, "I was born in the slum, but the slum was not born in me." I was born in the slum, but the slum was not born in me. You know that's a theological statement, right? The line is a statement of theological anthropology. It's an expression of the image of God. And what Jackson was saying, in effect, was dignity precedes circumstance. Dignity transcends circumstance. So that if someone is born into poverty, that does not downgrade their dignity. Dignity comes before, prior to, above, and supersedes whatever economic, geographic, racial, ethnic, class condition they may be born into. This is a theological statement. I was born in the slum was not born in me. From an early time, he was interested, not just interested, he was active in the civil rights movement as young as a high school and college student. And we need to keep front and center that it was Reverend Jesse Jackson. So he was actually theologically trained. He went to Chicago Theological Seminary, which was and is a very socially progressive seminary. And in that time, during the civil rights movement, he becomes closely associated with Martin Luther King Jr. and King's organization, the SCLC, which stands for Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And of course, there are all these powerful, tragic pictures. Jesse Jackson was present at the Lorraine Motel when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. But the movement kept going even after King's assassination, and Jesse Jackson was a big part of that. So he founded Operation PUSH, which is an acronym that stands for People United to Save Humanity, PUSH. He founded Operation PUSH in 1971, and then he later merged PUSH with the Rainbow Coalition to form the Rainbow/PUSH Coalition. That's the institutional home of most of his activism post-civil rights movement. And quite notably, Jesse Jackson ran for president not once but twice. He ran for the Democratic nomination for president. First in 1984, where he finished third in the primaries. Then again in 1988, where he came closer, he finished second in the primaries after Michael Dukakis. Now, can you imagine that campaign had it been Jesse Jackson versus George H.W. Bush in 1988? We might have had our first black president 20 years earlier. But Jackson is a bridge figure. He's one of the people who paved the way for Obama to be elected in 2008. And so he's incredibly remarkable, singular figure. But as I told a journalist who reached out to me, Jackson is singular. So he was known for his charisma, his charm, his ability to just capture the attention of an entire room instantly. So he's tall, he's handsome, he's outspoken. He reminds me of figures like Muhammad Ali. He reminds me of figures like Stokely Carmichael. These folks are black and proud. They are pretty and they know it. And they are confident and they are ambitious. And, Jackson entered a room and you couldn't help but notice him. So he is a singular figure in that sense. And then, of course, his career as a politician, as an activist, but he's also a representative figure. He's representative of people of the black civil rights generation who put their faith into practice publicly, whether that was through activism and organizing or even through presidential runs. So he was also emblematic of a lot of other types of people, from Fannie Lou Hamer to John Lewis to more recently Raphael Warnock and others. So both singular and representative. Now, he didn't complete a traditional Masters of Divinity in a normal timeline. Like when he was at Chicago Theological Seminary, he actually had to pause his education because his life of activism was taking up so much time. But he did receive his Master's of Divinity degree later in 2000. Now, at CTS, this is the mid-1960s, he was studying theology while engaged in the civil rights movement. So if you're a seminary student right now, you're getting a dual education. You are getting the classroom education, but you are also, if you're engaged in the struggle for justice and democracy right now, you're also getting a practical education. What it looks like on a street level and a grassroots level to organize for change. And then also in the classroom. I think that is an incredibly potent dual education that puts hands and feet to theology. And so the seminary Jackson is going to, as well as his own theological leanings, is towards social justice, ecumenism, public theology, anti-racism. That's how he's being formed and shaped in terms of his Christian beliefs. And of course, along with that classroom education, he's heavily influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. King wasn't just a political mentor; he was also a theological pattern for Jackson. Jackson absorbed King's methods of nonviolent resistance, rooted in Christian ethics, the agape love as political theology, not eros love or phileo love, but agape love, the beloved community as a social vision. Jackson picks up and absorbs and kind of makes his own from King. And then, of course, this fusion of prophetic critique and, if you will, a patriotic hope, a belief in the aspirational values of the nation. So King's beloved community becomes Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, and both are theological constructs before their political platforms. They are faith infused political platforms. And of course, Jackson isn't usually labeled in a formal way as a liberation theologian, but in many ways he was. He looked at economic justice as moral obligation. He looked in terms, he understood issues in terms of structural sin or systemic issues, not just individual interpersonal issues. He understood that God had a preferential option for the poor, as some traditions say, that God was looking out for the marginalized. And he looked at public policy, in other words, politics, through a moral lens, as questions of morals, and not something completely separate from the faith. And so he, in his 1988 speech, begins, I mean, it's a sermon. That 1988 speech is essentially a sermon on political theology. And he begins by saying, "Tonight we pause and give praise and honor to God." It's almost like the athlete after the game saying, first of all, I want to thank my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, right? Giving all glory to God. That's what Jackson does at the opening of this political speech at a political gathering. There is no separation there. And I think it's important because, yes, church and state should be separate, but we can never, and I don't think we should ever, separate our faith from our politics. That is to say, our religious commitments will shape our political commitments. That's just human. How could they not if these are your deeply held beliefs? But what we're going to get into this episode is contrasting the way Jackson, who was representative, I think, broadly of Black Christian political engagement, contrasts with a white Christian nationalist political engagement. And so both have religious commitments that are informing their political sentiments, but toward very different ends. So some key themes in Jackson's overall work, but especially as articulated in this 1988 speech: interdependence, common good, prophetic leadership, faith as moral courage. So let's get into it. Let's talk about Jackson's moral imagination as articulated in the Rainbow Coalition. The Rainbow Coalition wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was political theology. Jackson was translating his Christian beliefs into a perspective on politics that was racially, ethnically, culturally, economically inclusive. That's the rainbow part. It was a political articulation of e pluribus unum, that Latin phrase, out of many, one. And I think we need to revisit Jackson's vision of a rainbow coalition, because in terms of its significance, I think it is as profound and perhaps just as important as Obama's slogans, "Yes, we can," and "Change we can believe in." That's what he used in 2008. I think Jackson's Rainbow Coalition vision should also be spoken of in the same conversation of King's "I Have a Dream" and the beloved community. I think we should be talking about the Rainbow Coalition in the same breath as we talk about King's dream and the beloved community. I'll prove it to you. So in that speech in 1988, Jackson said, "When I look out at this convention, I see the face of America." Now he's using terms common in the 80s. And he says, red, yellow, brown, black, and white, we are all precious in God's sight. The real Rainbow Coalition. I was a kid in the 80s, so I wasn't that politically engaged. But I do have a sense that on a national political presidential stage, talking about a rainbow coalition of people of every race, ethnicity, and cultural background was a pretty radical statement. It would have stood in stark contrast to the other party's platform when they are declaring a war on drugs that is sending a militarized police force into black communities, when they are using tropes of welfare queens, black people supposedly gaming the system to swindle the people of the United States and the government out of money, your hard-earned tax dollars going to buy fur coats and Cadillacs from people who are cheating the system, right? And so this idea of a rainbow coalition stood in stark contrast to the politics of the far right at the time. And it's theological. The rainbow coalition says everybody counts. Everybody's included. And those are echoes of Genesis 1. Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness. That's the Imago Dei, the image of God. That's Revelation 7, verse 9. People of every tribe, tongue, and nation gathered around the throne, worshiping God. That's the Rainbow Coalition. Also in that speech, though, Jackson is a preacher, so he's using metaphors throughout his message. And I read the transcript of that 1988 convention speech, and I think the metaphor that gripped me most, maybe because it was surprising, I didn't realize this till I went back and read it, but this metaphor of a quilt. Here's what Jackson said. When I was growing up in Greenville, South Carolina, my grandmama couldn't afford a blanket, but she didn't complain and we did not freeze. Instead, she took pieces of old cloth, patches, wool, silk, gabardine, crocker sack, only patches, barely good enough to wipe off your shoes with, but they didn't stay that way very long. With sturdy hands and a strong cord, she sewed them together into a quilt, a thing of beauty and power and culture. Now, Democrats, we must build such a quilt. He goes on and says, workers, you fight for fair wages. You are right, but your patch of labor is not big enough. Women, you seek comparable worth and pay equity. You are right, but your patch is not big enough. And he goes through all of these categories of people with justified outrage and grievances and working toward justice for their particular cause. But he says, your patch is not big enough. And then he goes on and says, pull the patches and the pieces together, bound by a common thread. Wow. Your patch is not big enough. That is moral imagination. What Jesse Jackson is saying when he says your patch is not big enough is he's saying your silo cannot save you. Your identity alone cannot liberate you. And that coalition is not compromise, it is survival. We need each other. As King says, we are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality. It's interdependence. It's a patchwork quilt made up of all different kinds of people who are all passionate about different things, but sewn together by a common thread. Further in that speech, Jackson emphasizes this idea of common ground. So he's speaking to the Democratic Party, but he's speaking to a ideologically diverse Democratic Party. There are more moderates, there are more progressives, there are people all in the ideological political spectrum, even in the same political party. And he's saying, we got to come together. We got to find common ground. And he says politics can be a moral arena where people come together to find common ground. Now, by common ground, he didn't mean lowest common denominator. He didn't mean a sort of weak or milquetoast centrism. Common ground was, in his words, we find common ground at the plant gate that closes on workers without notice. We find common ground at the farm auction where a good farmer loses his or her land to bad loans or diminishing markets. Common ground at the schoolyard where teachers cannot get adequate pay and students cannot get a scholarship and can't make a loan. You see what he's doing there? He's saying our common ground is our common struggle. One of the powerful things that Jackson's Rainbow Coalition vision does is says it's not just about divisions across race or ethnicity, it's also about divisions across class. And he says what we're really dealing with is the ultra wealthy versus the rest of us. Does that sound familiar? The ultra wealthy versus the rest of us. Jackson was saying this in the 1980s. And so he's saying that because we have these uber capitalists who are trying to squeeze every amount of money from our labor and our systems, we actually have common ground because we have common struggles. Because our struggles are shared across lines of racial, ethnic, cultural division. Plant gates closing on workers, hospital rooms where people couldn't afford care, farm auctions, hospices for AIDS patients. In other words, what Jackson was saying was common ground was shared vulnerability. Jackson wanted people to come together politically because they all had a shared vulnerability. And that's the coalition part of the Rainbow Coalition. Not just diversity for diversity's sake. Hey, let's have all kinds of people in our club. No, let's actually have a coalition, co-allies together in the struggle, finding common ground, linked by this common thread of shared vulnerability and a desire for change, but also in this quilt, this patchwork where we don't have to lose our identity when we come together in the Rainbow Coalition. We can keep our identities, we can keep our passionate pursuits, but when we come together, we're stronger than when we're apart. That's the Rainbow Coalition. It's not naive optimism. It's hope as discipline, hope as resistance, hope as strategy. So what the Rainbow Coalition does is it brings, again, in the 1980s, like today, maybe we think this is more common, but imagine, 35 plus years ago? He brought Palestinians and South African apartheid into mainstream conversation. That was part of his political conversation. He talked about economic violence as real violence. He uses the phrase in that speech, economic violence. I think that's important. I think that's appropriate for the ways that people are exploited and put into poverty, especially in the wealthiest nation in the world. He called that economic violence. He centered the poor across race. So he wasn't just speaking to black people or poor people of color. He's like, white folk, y'all, as a matter of fact, by the numbers, y'all form a bigger portion of people in poverty than anyone else. So you're part of this too. And he talked about farmers, workers, women, students, black people, Latin people, Latino people, gays and lesbians, conservatives and progressives. All of them, all these groups are part of his vision for a Rainbow Coalition. Now, the first thing I thought of, besides Jackson's 1971 appearance on Sesame Street, where he leads the children in the chant, I am somebody, has them repeat after him. The second thing that occurred to me when I heard of his passing was the contrast between Jackson's vision of a rainbow coalition and the white Christian nationalist vision of politics. So I want to spend the rest of our time together contrasting the rainbow coalition versus white Christian nationalism. And I want to set it up on a series of axes: coalition versus cultural dominance, interdependence versus hierarchy, hope versus fear, the cross versus the flag. These are just some ways that we see the Rainbow Coalition setting up a contrast and a better vision than white Christian nationalism. So let's talk about coalition versus cultural dominance. So the Rainbow Coalition means no single group can survive alone. Your patch isn't big enough. And that coalition isn't dilution. It's not just the lowest common denominator. It's survival, it's shared vulnerability, it's the common good. Power is shared. That's coalition politics versus white Christian nationalism, which pursues cultural dominance. White Christian nationalism doesn't want a coalition, it wants control, and it operates from demographic anxiety, the great replacement theory. White people aren't having enough babies. We're going to be a minority. They're overpopulating our country. Demographic anxiety. Zero-sum politics. There is no give and take. There is no sense that even if they are the party in power, they should also govern for the sake of and the good of the rest of the people. Zero-sum politics. It's a will to power, and it's by any means necessary we're going to get this political power. And then it's nostalgia for a mythic Christian past. Now, you know, as a historian, I'm going to be all over this. We're in 2026. It's the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the nation's birthday, if you will. And what we are seeing out of this regime and its white Christian nationalist ideology is the reinscribing of a mythic past, that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, that it prospered because it followed a fundamentalist reading of Christianity, and that its prosperity is being threatened by un-American others, whether that be immigrants, transgender people, black people, you name the group. So they want to make America great again. That's nostalgia for a mythic past. That is cultural dominance versus coalition politics. So that's one set of axes. Another is interdependence versus hierarchy. So Jackson's Rainbow Coalition represents interdependence. White Christian nationalism represents hierarchy. In his speech, Jackson says this: "And so this night, we choose not a false sense of independence and our capacity to survive and endure. Tonight we choose interdependence and our capacity to act and unite for the greater good." Tonight we choose interdependence and our capacity to act and unite for the greater good. This is Bible. One body, many parts. No part can say to the other, I have no need of you. That's why he's saying interdependence. And there's a moral logic. We rise together, we fall together. That we, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's the idea in Rainbow Coalition politics. That's the idea of interdependence. Contrast that with white Christian nationalism, which is arguing for a hierarchy, a gender hierarchy. We haven't mentioned the so-called SAVE Act yet, which is going to stands to severely constrict voting participation, and by requiring things like a birth certificate to prove your citizenship, and if your name doesn't match your birth certificate, which of course for married women who change their last name, that's going to potentially pose a very big issue. So we talk about a gender hierarchy, and now On the far, far right extremes, but still public, is the conversation of household voting. Have you heard of that term? Household voting. So, what some folks are arguing for, many of them claiming to be Christian, they're saying every household should get a vote, not every person, not every eligible person, just one vote per household. And guess who they want to vote for the household? The man or the husband. And the wife or the spouse would just have to go along with what the man says. So when we talk about gender hierarchy, it's like real political and policy consequences. That is what we're dealing with white Christian nationalism versus interdependence. Hierarchy also goes to a racialized hierarchy. I have said this again and again. Please, there's I can't remember the title of the Substack article. I think it's an article where I write about Douglas Wilson, who's a far-right extremist pastor who's now influencing people like Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense. I won't call it Secretary of War. And in that article, I talk about what essentially white Christian nationalism is trying to do is reinscribe the plantation household structure. So on a plantation, the person in charge was the white, wealthy, male patriarch. The enslaver stood at the top of the pyramid. Beneath him was his white wife. Beneath her and them and him were the white children. Now I have to specify white wife, white children, because we all know that white enslavers abused enslaved black women. And so beneath his white family would come enslaved people, even if he had fathered children among the enslaved people. They were considered part of the household in a plantation society. But that didn't mean black people were equal with the enslaver's white family. What it meant was black people were considered perpetual children, and the white enslaver was considered the benevolent patriarch who had a duty and responsibility to care for and control the black people he enslaved. So they were never on an equal level with the white family, and they were always considered too immature, too incapable to govern or lead themselves. And they needed the wise, benevolent leadership of the white enslaver to be productive in work, to be cared for with food and clothing, and even to be instructed in Christianity. Does that sound familiar? When you really break it down, this is what white Christian nationalism envisions for society: a gender hierarchy and a racial hierarchy. By the way, I will not stop calling it white Christian nationalism, because I don't care how many mascots or tokens you get in terms of people of color. Ultimately, the vision is still white is right, white is superior, white is central, white will be on top. If you can't see that, you're not looking. I don't know what else to say to you. It is a white, racialized vision of Christian nationalism. And here's why I keep saying white Christian nationalism, because I think white people are still skittish about acknowledging the racialized aspect of white Christian nationalism. This is a little bit of a tangent, but it's important for us to acknowledge it, because if we don't say the white part out loud, you're going to think it's all about religion. You're going to think it's all about ideology. You're going to think it's all about politics. And it is that, but it's a racialized vision of religion. It's a racialized ideology. It's a racialized politics. And who is envisioned at the pinnacle of all of those racialized aspects? White people, specifically white ultra-wealthy men, which is not that far from who people call the founding fathers. These were really wealthy white men. Thomas Jefferson enslaved hundreds of people. That's a billionaire in today's terms. George Washington, the first president, enslaved people and had a practice of rotating them out to avoid the laws that said if a person was enslaved in Pennsylvania for a certain amount of time, they had to be emancipated. So he was calculating. And he was part of the ultra wealthy. I'm just saying. What kind of hierarchy do you think they want? And lastly, a religious hierarchy. They want Christian supremacy. White Christian nationalism wants Christian supremacy. They are not checking for Muslims, for Jewish people. There's even a divide within the far right over anti-Semitism. Are you anti-Semitic or not, right? But they're not checking for Hindu people. The only religion they want to acknowledge is their version of Christianity. Christian supremacy in law and in culture. So what I'm setting up is this contrast between Rainbow Coalition, interdependence, white Christian nationalism, hierarchy. The idea that some people are more foundational or important than others, and Jackson's Rainbow Coalition political theology challenges that. It levels the playing field for all people, while white Christian nationalism stratifies the field. I'm not done. I am almost done. Bear with me. Hope versus fear. Those are two other different kind of poles that Rainbow Coalition represents hope. White Christian nationalism represents fear. So in the Rainbow Coalition, we're going to talk about how Jackson closed it. The 3 words: keep hope alive. Hope is disciplined, it's collective, it's forward-looking, and it imagines a future that doesn't yet exist. In my latest book, The Spirit of Justice, the final chapter, I talk about 4 values that unite the people who worked for justice across 400 years of U.S. history. One of those values is imagination, particularly a moral imagination, a prophetic imagination. That's what the Rainbow Coalition is. It is envisioning a future that does not yet exist. Contrast that to white Christian nationalism's politics of fear of replacement, a fear of secularization. We're not going to be a Christian nation anymore. A fear of immigration and immigrants. They're taking over. A fear of cultural loss, our Western values. The Marco Rubio just gave a speech abroad about our Western civilization, Western society, Western culture, right? That's being replaced. We're losing that and rallying all these people on the basis of fear. Fear for white Christian nationalism is the emotional engine. But the Rainbow Coalition is the politics of hope. It expands moral imagination. White Christian nationalism contracts the moral imagination. And finally, the cross versus the flag. So Rainbow Coalition, Jackson consistently framed his politics in terms of the poor, the vulnerable, the excluded. We can go to Matthew 25. We can go Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. We can go to all kinds of Old Testament passages in Isaiah 61, Isaiah 58, even the first chapter of Isaiah. We can look at Amos. We can look at Micah. Who are they talking about? The poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, the oppressed, the excluded. But white Christian nationalism is fusing the cross, the flag, military power, and national destiny. I had to throw this in there because Jesse Jackson was an outspoken critic of Ronald Reagan. And he talks in the speech about Reaganomics. And here's what he says. Reaganomics, based on the belief that the rich had too little money and the poor had too much. That's classic Reaganomics. They believed that the poor had too much money and the rich had too little money, so they engaged in reverse Robin Hood, took from the poor and gave to the rich. paid for by the middle class. We cannot stand 4 more years of Reaganomics in any version, in any disguise. I just love he goes further and just does a complete takedown of Reagan's outlook on economics and trickle down theory and all of that BS, which really harmed the poor and the middle class, meanwhile made the rich get even richer. So essentially what we're seeing here with the Rainbow Coalition and white Christian nationalism is 2 different futures. With the Rainbow Coalition, we're talking about a multi-ethnic democracy, shared power, economic justice, religious pluralism, and expanding definitions of who belongs. What are we seeing with white Christian nationalism? What future do they envision? A majoritarian dominance, cultural dominance, Christian supremacy, a restriction of pluralism, and a narrow definition of who belongs. 2 different futures. The question is not whether religion will shape politics. It already does. The question is, will it shape politics through fear and hierarchy, as white Christian nationalism does, or will religion shape politics through hope and shared humanity, as the Rainbow Coalition does? Of course, we know what Jesse Jackson offered. Jesse Jackson didn't believe in a fragile nation. He believed in a resilient nation. He believed in the promise of the United States, a country woven together, a church that was committed to the poor and the marginalized. He believed in a politics rooted in the imagination, in moral imagination, and he believed in a people who refused to surrender to despair. I love this line from his speech. He said, "If an issue is morally right, it will eventually be political." If an issue is morally right, it will eventually be political. Those are the words I've been searching for. Those are the words I've wanted to say to pastors who remain silent or tepid in this moment. Those are the words I want to say to faith leaders of all kinds, to embolden them to speak up and to step up. Those are the words that our congregations need to hear. Those are the words that the disillusioned need to hear. Those are the words that the apathetic need to hear. Those are the words that the cynical need to hear. If an issue is morally right, it will eventually be political. Because if it's morally right, it ought to be practiced in policy. And now you're getting political. If an issue is morally right, it will eventually be political. The Rainbow Coalition was never just about elections. It was about reimagining belonging. And in a moment when white Christian nationalism divides, the Rainbow Coalition promises e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Justice Briefing. If this resonated with you, please share it. And also remember, in the words of Jesse Jackson, keep hope alive.